the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan and we will analyse the AUKUS Alliance, and in particular we will also deep dive into how the AUKUS Alliance has triggered a geopolitical alignment, or realignment we should say there. Why has this Anglophone AUKUS Alliance formed and what's the fallout? For example, what does China do now? And how will Australia assert itself as the Southern Hemisphere's military great power? How does the AUKUS Alliance impact on the applied foreign policies of regionally independent nations like New Zealand and indeed the ASEAN economies? And where to from here for France and Europe, for China and Southeast Asian nations like we mentioned just then, and New Zealand? We're going to hone right in on that. And remember, if you're joining us live, we can include your comments in this program. So let's get this show on the road, as they say, and we'll cross to Paul, who is waiting online to unpack these issues and a lot more. Good afternoon, Paul.
Tēnā koe, Selwyn. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Good to see you. Ka pai mātua. Paul, let's get right down and look at the issue. There's been obviously an announcement a few weeks ago relating to the AUKUS Alliance, and once again, just to anchor that in, that's a military alliance that's signed up between the United Kingdom, the United States of America and Australia. That forward commits those three countries, doesn't it, to defence positions and any conflict that may arise in each country's respective interests. I think, once again, just break any of that down. But in the meantime, over the last 2 weeks, we have seen geopolitical manoeuvrings from the point of view of most notably, I suppose, on the world stage, Paul, with France, and certainly with respect to the European nations, the EU nations. We've seen a change in leadership in Germany. We've seen the president of France, Macron, actually rising and ascending in that status as a European leader and pulling together some interesting events, shall we say. So, Paul, that's a brief summary. Can I just hand it over to you to define it how you see it, please?
Well, yeah, this is part of the reason why it's always fun to talk with you, because you expanded out a little beyond the usual coverage. So we'll get to Europe in a second, but thanks for that. Okay, so what we see here is the consolidation of a de facto containment policy on the People's Republic of China, particularly their maritime aspirations. I mean, this nuclear power deal, is a seismic shift in regional politics, because you can't look at it in isolation. This follows on the heels of the creation of the Quad, as it's called. I think it's called the Quadrennial Security Arrangement between Japan, India, Australia, and the United States.
Yes.
This now brings the UK into it, and it brings nuclear propulsion subs into the equation. That's going to dramatically shift the regional balance of naval power against the Chinese and in favor of the West. And then we have to remember that there are other military arrangements in place in the Western Pacific, like the Five Powers Agreement, which is the UK, Malaysia, Australia, and Singapore. Which are nominally concerned about, their regional waters and whatnot. But let's face it, the biggest threat to regional autonomy and the security of the sea lanes of communication through the Malaccan Straits and throughout the Indo-Pacific is the People's Republic of China and their very, very aggressive maritime expansion policies. So not only have we seen now the emergence of Australia as the first great military power in the Southern Hemisphere, something we talked about briefly a couple of weeks ago, but we see this consolidation of what is a de facto containment policy, where all these naval assets will be arrayed primarily against the People's Liberation Army, Navy, as it's known, in the South China and East China Seas, what is known as the first island chain. See, the Chinese have a geopolitical doctrine that is based on successive island chains. The first one is Japan to the Philippines to Borneo, basically the East and South China Seas. They consider that their territorial waters, and that's where they're disputing the presence of the United States, and they're making territorial claims on all of their neighbors. The second island chain extends out from Japan through Guam down to Papua New Guinea, and that's where the Chinese are headed with their Blue Water Fleet. All of this that we're talking about is about preventing them from doing so unimpeded. And so it also marks the formal pivot to the Pacific on the part of not only the United States, but the UK. The UK is now going to put a lot of it, if not most of its maritime assets into the Indo-Pacific, will probably forward base most of its subs as well as its carrier group in Diego Garcia Island. And what that leaves is, it leaves NATO. It leaves NATO on the outers. It leaves, and we mentioned France. This, weirdly enough, is a continuation of Trump's policy vis-a-vis NATO. Biden's not going back to emphasizing the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance as the priority in U.S. strategic thinking. Those days are over. Now, he's not going to be a bully and tell NATO that they got to pay 2% of their GDP and what have you. But think of it this way. The primary focus of NATO since its inception was a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, they had no reason for being. So they got into Afghanistan, they got into Iraq, they got into Libya, they got into nation building, all these things that involved non-existential threats, in which, quite frankly, expended blood and treasure uselessly. Now the Russians are back. So NATO has its primary concern back in front of it. And I think what the United States and the UK are saying to NATO is, you know what, guys? You have to arrange your security priorities based upon your conception of threat, not ours. We're too busy in the Western Pacific, so you need to reorient back to countering the Russians, and here's where France comes in. France is not a member of NATO. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but France obviously shares concerns with regards to Russian adventurism. With the absence of Angela Merkel on the scene, and the emergence of whoever follows Angela Merkel will be not as powerful as her. Germany will not have the stature that it has enjoyed under the 16 years of Merkel's rule. And so this is an opportunity for the French to step in and exercise a leadership role within the EU and European security communities. And I think that's exactly what Macron's going to do. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, at the end of the day, canceling the French nuclear deal, the French submarine deal, is going to reduce to a matter of breakpoints. The French now have gotten over their hissy fit. They're sending their ambassadors back to Washington and Canberra. And most interestingly, as we discussed, we saw this coming, they're discussing what are known as breakpoints. That is, how much will it cost the Australians to have broken that original contract? The original contract was worth 38 billion euros. I'd say the French will wind up getting about 10% of that for the efforts they put in the 5 years in which the contract was valid, and we'll move on because the French fully know that the deal is too good for the Australians to pass up on. I mean, state-of-the-art nuclear-powered submarines versus some second-hand diesel types, and French maritime security in the Pacific is increased without costing a cent to them or them having to increase any assets in the Pacific. The Pacific fleet that the French have is very small. It's based in Tahiti, and it has occasional sub visits, but there's no permanent subs in there. And I'm mentioning subs a lot because they are by far the most effective platform in any Navy's inventory, aircraft carriers notwithstanding. Subs kill aircraft carriers as a matter of course. And so the French actually will benefit from the strategic shift without having to lift a finger. So I think it's all about the money and less about security when it comes to the French, who again have on their doorstep major concerns with the Russians, not only on the central flank, if you will, but also on the southern fringes, the Black Sea, and then into Mesopotamia and the Levant.
Yeah, just picking up on a couple of things there. For example, in the French territories in the Pacific, it seems like what France was doing, as well as a reaction to the nuclear deal that it lost with respect to Australia, is basically making a lot of noise. It's staking its claim as a significant power in the wider Pacific region. We're talking French Polynesia, etc. And it also seemed to me that it seized an opportunity. There was a window of opportunity that was coinciding, as you've detailed there, with the change in leadership in Germany. The elections in Germany were well advanced at the time when this AUKUS deal was announced. And France, in particular its President Macron, moving into that space. At the same time, it loses the deal with Australia on the building of the nuclear ships. It starts talks with other EU partners on addressing exactly that issue. It's got the technologies, it's got the abilities to deliver, and it starts in talks with other countries in the southern areas of the EU on specifically that point of manufacturing. So it's like it seized its opportunity, it's moved, it's realigned. And like you say, in the Pacific, it's got an element of, well, it benefits in some way as well. And in some ways too, French Polynesia is an area of which it's dominated, and the other global powers like China have not affected it as much as they have. Their presence hasn't stamped their presence as much as what it has in Melanesia and those Western Pacific areas, perhaps. Paul, that's the way I see it. And I'm not trying to paraphrase where you went. What fascinates me in the whole issue here is, once again, the region, the Southeast Asia region, the Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific, Indo-Pacific, however we want to define this. We've seen English-speaking, the Anglophone imperialist nations, if we want to put it that way in a critical sense, of the United Kingdom, the United States and Australia, and recognising the huge support that liberal national coalitions have from a very royalist, very traditional constituency. And it's almost as if it's coming down and forgetting all of the post-World War II years and the realignments that took part in those decades. And it's saying, here we are, we're steaming through, and this is how it's going to be. I know that's in simple terms, but how do you believe the ASEAN states, those economies that operate within the Southeast Asia area, where English is a universal global language, obviously, but their first language and their first commitment is to their own indigenous people? How do you think they respond to this alliance coming down of these very white, imperialistic, historically significant countries?
Well, it's an interesting question. Certainly there is a post-colonial element to it, but we have to be very clear. This new containment policy in the Indo-Pacific focused on China is precipitated by Chinese behavior. The neighbors surrounding China, particularly in Indochina, are increasingly wary of Chinese bullying in and around the South China Sea. And let's be very clear. The Chinese have many justified reasons to want to expand their naval presence, not only in the first island chain, but out to the second island chain, which, if you extend it westward, includes the so-called string of pearls port basing theory. That is, the Chinese want to acquire basing rights in Pakistan, Sri Lanka. They have a naval base in Djibouti. And so they want to be able to at least monitor the sea lanes of communication throughout the Indian Ocean. Why? Because it turns out, I read this fact yesterday and actually had to double check. I was so astounded. 80% of China's trade with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa passes through the Indian Ocean and the Malaccan Straits. 95% of its imported oil, period, comes through the Indian Ocean, through the Malaccan Straits. So if we're going to be honest, if the United States can have a global naval presence to secure the sea lanes of communication for commerce and trade, then certainly the Chinese have an equal right to do so. So what's the difference other than post-colonial hypocrisy? The difference is the bullying. Now you can say, well, the Americans have been global bullies for many years, and quite frankly, having grown up in Latin America, I can't really argue with that.
Yeah.
The thing here is twofold. On the one hand, the West, the United States, the community of European nations, truly believed after the end of the Cold War that, remember that liberal internationalist mantra, that the combination of market economies and liberal democracies would be the best economic political combination for everybody in the world, and that included China. Instead, China, after a period of liberalization, has become increasingly authoritarian, not only at home, I guess that's within its rights, that's their sovereign territory, but also in this wolf warrior diplomacy and military diplomacy abroad. It bullies. And a friend of mine back in Washington said you would have thought that they would have learned from the experience of the original colonialists. Don't be racist, don't be cruel, try to win over people rather than browbeat them. And yet the Chinese have repeated the mistakes of the European colonialists and then added a few of their own in places like the South Pacific. So the precipitant that has turned many of the populations of Southeast Asia against the Chinese and in favor of the West is Chinese behavior. And that, I think, is reducible to the Chinese Communist Party under President Xi Jinping. I think that he has a particular mindset.
Yeah.
But remember, too, we talked about this a long time ago. I'll finish with this.
Right.
It's not as if the Chinese were always welcome. You and I talked about this a long time ago. My experience living in Singapore, looking at Malaysia and Indonesia, is that ethnic Chinese in places like Malaysia and Indonesia are treated as if they were the Jews of Southeast Asia. That is, because of their prominence in commerce, in finance, they do very well, but they're ethnic minorities in these countries. They're treated with some wariness. Singapore, not so much, because Singapore is majority Han Chinese, but that's precisely why it was kicked out of the Malay Federation. The Chinese have had decent relations with the Filipinos, but that's deteriorated in recent years. So my point is this: there was never a strong reservoir of goodwill towards the Chinese. Think of the Vietnamese and how they feel about the Chinese. And so, bygones being bygones with regards to the West, many of these countries like the fact that they're getting an enhanced security guarantee against Chinese encroachment on the very sea lanes of communication that are vital to Southeast Asian trade.
What you've detailed there is exactly a point that I was going to raise, that in this situation, where you've got global powers that are juxtapositioning, where you've got this AUKUS alliance that is formed, and its purpose is to contain the rise and the grip, if you like, and the behaviours of the People's Republic of China. It's a perfect situation where there are no good guys and bad guys in this thing. You strip it all out, that what you're left with are powers that are in the patch, in our region, that are positioning on a very dangerous juxtaposition, where they believe that to do nothing is equally as dangerous. I would suggest that it would be folly for people that are looking and perhaps have a peaceful bent to think that China is the victim. Equally, I think it's folly to think that the Anglophone Alliance is a benign presence that's going to come and save the region from itself. If you're looking at that, and if it can be argued successfully, and I think history, and you mentioned having grown up in Latin America, of elements that would lead you to question and critique the United States' interests in some ways. I think I've put that right. Where do countries like New Zealand, for example, that has long sought to have not only an independent foreign policy, but an independent voice on the world stage, where do you think it should go with such things like this? Should, as what we have seen, the government of New Zealand, and I personally think it has positioned itself correctly here, basically to accept what it can change and to accept what it can't, and that this alliance is something that it can't change, and to then seek out its own sovereign interests, its own trade interests, its own defence interests within the region of which it can engage. And we're talking in the Polynesian side of the Southwest Pacific here. So, Paul, that's how I see that. And I know these are basic premises, but considering that, do you see that New Zealanders, and I think it was Corin Down on Radio New Zealand that referred to it as such, that New Zealand's in the sweet spot here?
I think the government has played this one very well. I paused because I was thinking about how this whole situation reminds us of the strength of realism as a interpreter as well as a practice in foreign policy. You know, we've had idealistic moments. You know, foreign policy is a living, breathing thing. It's made of humans, for humans, over time. And so we may have moments of idealism. There's a whole school of thought called constructivism, where you construct international institutions that constrain individual state behavior for the good. All of that has been found wanting in the last 5 years. You know, you might put some of it on Trump, but it's been coming. That is, this liberal world order, that myth of liberal internationalism, it's been destroyed. And right now, we're in a period of great power politics, where realism is absolutely essential. And let's also remember that great power politics mean manipulation of international norms and rules by the great powers. I mean, people are simply not playing by the rules once they in the way they used to. So, for a small country like New Zealand, we got to be very careful how we tread in this minefield of international relations. And so, I know that there are pacifists in New Zealand who, and in fact, I've had mouthpieces express this in the press abroad, that we should come down more harder on non-proliferation issues, that we should have denounced the AUKUS arrangement, thrown a hissy fit over the fact that the Australians are going to get nuclear-powered submarines. The fact is, nuclear-powered submarines transit the South Pacific at will. No one can stop them. Nuclear-powered aircraft carriers make port visits all over the Western Pacific, with the exception of New Zealand, because of our anti-nuclear policy. Us jumping up and down and making a furor over it serves no purpose other than please the Chinese, who obviously are justified in seeing this for what it is, which is an effort to contain them. So I would say, and I agree with you that I think it's been played well. I think the downside is that we have to tiptoe. The upside is New Zealand gets an enhanced security guarantee without lifting a finger. No nuclear sub is going to announce a visit to New Zealand territorial waters. But what nuclear subs will do is shadow the Chinese submarine fleet when they come into New Zealand waters, which we know they do, including Chinese nuclear subs. I could go into a whole exegesis about submarine warfare, where getting off the east coast of New Zealand is advantageous for ballistic missile submarines, that is the so-called boomers that the Chinese, the Russians, and of course the Americans and UK have, because they have ranges over 10,000 kilometers. So if they hide in the South Pacific, they can launch and hit either China or mainland United States, depending on who's doing the triggering. So my point simply is that New Zealand has to be careful because of its trade dependency with China. It has to be careful because of its security dependence on the Australians and the Americans. And it is being very careful. And so far, in its pronouncements on AUKUS, I quite frankly think it's threaded the needle, if you will, and it's done so quite adroitly.
If we just look at some of the reaction within the Australasian region to the AUKUS announcement, and also where in the last 2 weeks things have been positioning. And of course, we've had the United Nations General Assembly. What we did see there is, unlike many nations, including New Zealand, we actually saw the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, go to New York to attend both the General Assembly, but significantly a bilateral with the United States President Joe Biden. If we can talk to that point, but in the first instance, that in New Zealand there has been much debate about some of these issues that you've been talking about. Paul, I agree with you 100% that I think New Zealand is in its perfect position. If it was accepted and it was debated, and successfully so, that this particular government was going to move to a more independent positioning with respect to our foreign policy and defence policies, and that our gravitation, as we mentioned before, was going to be on the Polynesian side more of the Pacific, that our defence arrangements, instead of being configured perhaps to assist in conflict as such on stages or theatres that are far beyond New Zealand's territorial waters, the alignment was going to be more on disaster relief, logistics and support, as opposed to the other side of the coin. So we see New Zealand kind of moving very comfortably into a position of where it would be desirable for it to be located on such things. We've seen some criticisms, and I'll just bring it up here very, very briefly, Paul, with respect to the Guardian piece by Bryce Edwards. And Bryce Edwards is really taking the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, to task, where he says she needs to speak out on AUKUS. Her tacit approval allows a dangerous military build-up. From my position here, and I think that by the sound of it, you would be on the same page, I think New Zealand does not need to do that. And in some ways, it's that old adage about have the sensibility and the wisdom to know what things you can change and then try to actually decide what those issues are. And this is one where it can't, but perhaps its voice with respect to the nuclear-free regions of the Pacific elevates New Zealand's relevancy in those quarters perhaps more than it has in the last two decades perhaps. And I'll just touch on Australia here, Paul. Inside Australia, the Liberal National Coalition is what people are seeing. That is where the decision-making has been coming from. The Liberal coalition, Liberal-led coalition, cannot stand if it does not have the support of the Nationals Party, which is a rural-based party. People overseas, perhaps in the United States, would recognise the leader of the Nationals, not by name. Barnaby Joyce mean nothing to them, but Johnny Depp, the actor, when he couldn't get his dogs to be able to be immigrating into Australia for whatever reason, for some temporary kind of movie or position he was doing at the time, referred to Barnaby Joyce as an overripe tomato, or tomato in the United States. But that is what we're talking about here. Barnaby Joyce and those guys that are in the Nationals Party in Australia, they are royalist at their bent. They are conservative to the cows when the cows come home. They are agriculture to the end of the day. They are, in some quarters, it would be fair to say, xenophobic. The Liberals are a different kettle of fish. You know, they are what they are. And we can see that the debate by this article in the Sydney Morning Herald, where I'm referring to the former Prime Minister of Australia, who is Malcolm Turnbull, who was very significant player for many decades in many different arenas. And the headline here, and it's a direct quote to him, this handling of the nuclear submarine decision was clumsy, deceitful, and costly. And I suppose what Turnbull is talking about there is the realities of that right up to recent weeks prior to that announcement being made, where the Australian Foreign Minister, Australian Defence Minister, were in talks with the French relating to this manufacturing nuclear submarine deal that they were working on. Not once did they indicate that that wasn't going to come to pass. And that's where this issue of clumsy, deceitful and costly is coming into things. So we're just getting back now on track, Paul, just having said that and giving a little bit of contextual detail to what we've been talking about. Let's pivot, if we can, over to those meetings that took place in the United States. I know that the United States was saying through its press that it was intending to have Australia actually meet its obligations with respect to climate policy, mainly emissions, etc., etc. The Nationals were always dragging the Liberals with a sea anchor out the back on such policies, and it did seem that the United States sought an opportunity, and this AUKUS deal certainly presents it, to say, you're on board with us now. We want you to come to the party. Trump's gone. Where we are different is on climate change, and we want you guys to bring this policy forward in a way that is in agreement with us. That seems to be the backstory. How did it map out, Paul?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think that what Biden did was a classic carrot and stick. He said to the Australians, we can offer you this package with regards to submarines, but in order to do so, you got to come a little way on climate change. We need your help here. And you guys have been, as you said, you've been dragging the chain on this. And you're simply going to have to tell, particularly your agricultural interests, your mining interests, that they're going to have to start engaging in carbon emission schemes and the like in a sincere way, just as we have to do in the United States, because Biden's got his own troubles. But that allows, the carrot is so huge in the form of these nuclear-powered submarines that it allows the conservative government in Australia, because let's be honest, it is quite conservative, to overcome the fears of its farmers and miners, because they're, quite frankly, xenophobic. I mean, yes, their business interests are often attuned towards the Chinese market, but those days are over. And they're over because of Chinese behavior. Again, the Chinese slapped all sorts of tariffs on the Australians because the Australians dared to ask for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID virus. They just wanted an independent WHO inquiry. The Chinese freaked out and started slamming economic sanctions. That tells you how they play. So I think that Biden was in an advantageous moment. And he took opportunity of that fact, the desire for the Australians to push back on the Chinese in order to introduce the climate change initiative into the package. And if so, there was nothing deceitful about it. It was a quiet negotiation while the Australians were simultaneously talking to the French about timetables, perhaps disengagement. Morrison said that he gave Macron a heads up that all was not well with the status of the contract vis-a-vis those diesel submarines. Now, I will say something else to the Edwards criticism. Apparently, Edwards hasn't watched the last 10 years of the Australian military buildup, a buildup that has included 5 consecutive years of 2.5% of GDP put into the Australian Defence Forces, a buildup that has seen the Australians acquire state-of-the-art American military technology, F-35s, Aegis-type class cruisers, missile-guided frigates, the works, the absolute works. This has been going on for 10 years. The submarines are just the cherry on top. But the ongoing military buildup of the Australians to become a great power in the Southern Hemisphere is at least a decade old. And even if you neglect that, as Edwards has, what purpose would it serve for the Prime Minister of New Zealand to start barking? She said the most effective thing, which was, those boats are not welcome in New Zealand waters. That's it. That's all she had to say. She's not condoning anything, but she knows the limitations of small powers. And so she said they're not welcome here. End of story. End of story. We, as it turns out, we engage in anti-submarine warfare exercises with the Americans and Australians all the time. We're about to upgrade our airborne anti-submarine warfare fleet with the acquisition of P-8 patrol aircraft to replace these very old P-3s. Guess who they integrate their systems with? The Australians and the Americans. So they're going to be talking to those nuclear boats at some point in time. So this fiction that we are pure, that we keep, our territory clean of anything nuke is rubbish. It's rubbish. We just don't acknowledge them. We let them go about their business quietly, and we ask that they don't make it public that we have certain relationships with them that allow their nuclear-propelled, certainly their nuclear-propelled, perhaps nuclear-armed vessels to transit in and around New Zealand waters. So, the reality is this government understood the situation. It will involve us on the margins to the benefit of New Zealand. And the less we say, other than nuclear-powered vessels are not welcome in New Zealand, the better we are. And that's exactly what has happened. So I think the criticism, both in Australia and in New Zealand, has nothing to do with foreign policy and security. It has all to do with domestic politics. I mean, Turnbull, comes up and says, he may be right. It could be that it was clumsy, but the Australians are clumsy when it comes to foreign policy. I hate to say it, but they are. Now, deceitful, what's that old adage? If a politician says no, if a diplomat says no, he means maybe. If he says maybe, he means yes. And if he says yes, he's lying. So,
sounds like a car salesman, Paul.
Well, I think maybe they're born of the same mothers. But, the fact is that Turnbull is scoring political points against his successor. Someone that, let's just say he doesn't have a good personal relationship with. And the nationalists in the Australian coalition are not going to stand in the way of acquiring nuclear-powered subs under any circumstance. So they're going to have to bite the bullet and agree to the climate change provisions that are part of the AUKUS deal.
And they have, in soft measure, if we put it in that way. So basically through their silence. So it's an interesting position. It's one that I guess when we were discussing last week's program that we postponed till this week, that we predicted ourselves that that the nationals in Australia were going to silently go on board with this because of their royalist connections, their conservative connections, and certainly their desire amongst their constituencies to support a stronger Anglophone military presence and indeed an alliance in the region. So I think the Liberals knew that. And this, in some ways, wasn't just Biden's opportunity, it was also Scott Morrison in leading the modern Liberal Party in such a way that he knew he would be able to get this through at home as well. And perhaps, if you look at Australian domestic politics, that in some way for middle voters would be a defining measure, if you like, in the elections that it looks like they're going to take place next year, meaning 2022 in Australia. So that's the federal elections, of course. So it's an interesting thing. Okay, let's get down to this, Paul, as we end into the last quarter of the program. Do you believe that Europe, that NATO will benefit from what has come to pass? And what I'm talking about there is obviously the United States' interest in going with the United Kingdom and Australia in a global kind of sense there, and that members of the European Union, significantly led by France's interests in this stage. Do you believe that they will be able to form a strong and enduring, sustainable defence pact amongst themselves up there? Do you believe that the Indo-Pacific region is going to be safer because of this, as we know that we've discussed in previous episodes, that it does look like China is seeking its own resource to sustain its domestic goals from other regions as opposed to the Pacific side? And do you think that New Zealand's future is going to be a better one because of this alignment in similar fashion, Paul?
Well, I think the Europeans, we have to remember that most European countries, with the exception of some well-known maritime nations, have what we call a continental geopolitical strategy. That is, their focus is on land-based threats. And for most Europeans, the land-based threats come from the east, they come from Russia, and that's what they're now free to focus on. because the United States, Great Britain being one of those maritime countries, have clearly shifted their focus to the maritime battle space and the possibilities of conflict with China. I mean, for all the talk about Afghanistan, terrorism, and whatnot, the fact of the matter is that as far as the U.S. and the U.K. are concerned, the greatest military threat is posed by China and its military expansion. And its military expansion is led by the Chinese Navy. So it allows the Europeans, if you will, to free up, to focus on what's right in front of them, rather than what the Americans want them to look at. Because that's been the problem for the last 20 some odd years, is that the United States demands of its allies loyalty, fealty, and for them to carry the water in wars that not only are not existential to them, but which are tangential to their national security interests. And so this allows them to reconsolidate and promote a NATO geopolitical doctrine that serves the interests of that community and not the interests of the United States, which again has been the case for at least 2 decades and probably more. Now, I will say this, and without betraying any confidences, but you and I had a conversation with some Chinese diplomats a few years ago. And as part of that discussion, you may recall that we suggested that if they really wanted to show goodwill, what have you, that asking to be invited into the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be a good way of doing so, because it also would be a hedge against U.S. control of the economic affairs of that economic community. And I remember us saying, however, you will be denied. That is, you should make the overture, so you show your goodwill, but it'll be refused, because the United States is all about containing you economically and militarily, not about inviting you in. Well, I bring up that anecdote because that's exactly what the Chinese did last week. They've asked to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the absence of the United States. Who would have thought it? The Chinese have a chance of getting in because Trump, in his hubris, pulled the U.S. out. And I say that because if the Chinese see AUKUS for what it is, a containment policy, but one that is very focused on the military side of the equation, not so much focused on the economic and trade side of the equation. If they stop with this wolf warrior nonsense, take a softer approach that emphasizes China's absolutely core importance to the global system of trade and exchange, I'd be willing to bet that they'll reap the benefits of that. Because at the end of the day, when you see these strategic alliances being formed, it's all about balance of power politics. It's all about influencing the target actor's behavior. And you don't just want to coerce them. You want to convince them that a different course of action is in their benefit. And so if you raise the costs of military adventurism while suppressing the costs of opening trade, you give the Chinese not only a means of saving face, because the Chinese leadership is confronted with that issue, but you give them an outlet where their economic resurgence or restoration can occur quicker in the post-pandemic years, because there's a whole sidebar about how the Chinese economy is not doing as well as its leaders would like us to believe. So I think, these moves are influencing behavior both in Europe and in Asia. The question is, will it influence that behavior for the good or for the worse? And my thought is, if there are skilled hands running the diplomatic and military affairs both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, this move away from military confrontation towards, a re-emphasizing of non-coercive trade relationships can actually be a good thing, because the balance of power will be, if not restored, I mean, China's here to stay. And so the idea that you're going to roll them back all the way to the Formosa Straits is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But
Just,
if you recognize their legitimate
yeah.
interests and say you simply cannot bully your way to becoming the regional hegemon. See, there's this concern that they want to remove the United States and put themselves in as the regional hegemon. I personally would prefer a situation where there's a balance of maritime powers, where there is no hegemon. And because there is no hegemon, no one can impose their will on everybody else, which means the sea lanes of communication and trade will remain open.
Yeah. Just with respect to China and what we were talking about there, the messages that have come through whenever there's been any interaction relating to diplomatic corps that I've been a part of have also been countered very strongly from the Chinese and their sensitivities of alliances. For example, when New Zealand was positioning and indeed did sign a declaration with the United States on security over in Washington, known as the Washington Declaration, the Chinese sensitivities were very, very strong and underscored on whether or not it was a declaration or alliance. And the thing that is important there is with respect to an alliance and the forward commitment to those countries signing up to an alliance, forward commitment to joining the others in conflict should it be called for. The declaration gives wiggle room, let's put it that way. Those were the areas there. And also, I think, the Chinese position has been one historically where they accentuate that they defend their mainland, but they don't have an expansionist invasion policy, if you like. Now, some would say, well, look at Tibet, look at other fringe things on that. So the debate couldn't extend to that in the wisdom of the audience, I believe. So with this, Paul, we've got some quite a lot of comments actually that have come in, and I've just starred a few of them, and I'll just run through a few of those here and then pass to you for a final last word, Paul. So what we're looking at here is we've got a couple of comments that have come in from Liz Hughes, and she's a regular watcher and listener to this live podcast recordings, and thank you for that. And Liz is talking about, we go back to the debate in this episode relating to the Australians. Australians speak out against nuclear submarines and AUKUS. Australia cannot become a staging point for the United States military. So she's voicing a very strong view that is coming through from various sectors in Australia, and I think where the merits in that are with those responses, I encourage the audience to look through the Facebook responses and the YouTube responses too that are coming through, and read through and have their say on such things. Also, what Liz has put here is she's saying that when it comes to security in general terms, it depends on your definition of security. And once again, that's within the context of the conversations that are there, and encourage people to go and look at that. Denny Thompson, he puts the question, who is most likely to nuke Australia? So he's getting down to the tin tacks here. He's saying A, China, B, France, C, North Korea, all of the above is point D, O and E, the US by friendly fire. So it's a little bit of good old Denny with a bit of the humour there. And I remember when I was reporting on 50 years after the battle at Monte Cassino, the New Zealand soldiers that are up there, including the Māori battalion, had a saying that when the Germans bomb, you dig in and find shelter. When the English bomb, then you get into a foxhole and you find some cover for yourself. Otherwise, it's your folly. When the Americans bomb, you're dead. So that was with respect to the friendly fire kind of thing. So thank you to Denny for that. Sambro, he comes in from Facebook on his comments, and he's saying half of that hundreds of billions is nuclear. He's talking about the costs. It's New Zealand that has to let go of Australia, UK, and America. So no more Five Eyes. And Paul doesn't think that it'll happen, and neither do I. And what he's saying there is he's positioning himself into what is a political realism kind of position there. Craig Burns, Craig has talked here, he's got a couple of comments, and Craig has been located in Australia for a time. He says, Australia already has a nuclear reactor, now the aim is uranium enrichment. What he's talking about there is whether or not there's mission creep and nuclear propelled submarines suddenly become nuclear armed. And I think, Paul, you've written about this in saying that the submarines that the Australians have committed to with the United States' deal here are not actually fitted out to be able to carry such things. But then there's the issue of relating to leasing submarines. I guess people would counter with that. And Craig Burns also says here too, even the zero carbon deal for Australia leads to a domestic nuclear power option. He's talking clearly about the debate relating to the new nuclear technologies. And we saw the United States, General Motors, I think it was, trying to actually get Tonga in the South Pacific to agree to having these small nuclear reactors the size of refrigerators. And they nearly got the deal across. There was a change in the king through death, and it seemed to have gone cold. And I've got to say, New Zealand diplomats were arguing very strongly, persuading in an attempt to persuade Tonga's government not to do that. And I think the adage was, who wants nuclear reactors the size of refrigerators bobbing around should a tsunami go across in that volcanic region? Sam Bro, he also says here, and just in closing now with the comments, we can't stop the subs, sorry. 200 billion is just too much to stop. New Zealand has to go independent. So there we are, Paul. Those are the comments of today, and I really thank you and salute those people who have taken the time to make comments for the program. Over to you, Paul. Last word.
Thanks everybody for the considered commentary. I mean, the fact is that we've got to separate out things like the Five Eyes, which again is an intelligence sharing network, from military affairs. Of course, they share with the militaries of each of the countries, but they're not synonymous. They're different things. And so we could actually maintain we do maintain our anti-nuclear stance. We might even strengthen it somehow, although there'll be diplomatic repercussions for that, without interfering with the Five Eyes. Now, if you want to argue whether Five Eyes is worth the costs in terms of whatever benefits New Zealand accrues, that's a separate discussion. And I'm happy to indulge it. I mean, I happen to think that the benefits outweigh the costs, but I'm just one person with an opinion. And so I would separate the two. At the end of the day, the left in New Zealand and Australia are not strong enough to overcome the security conservatives. I mean, there aren't as many security conservatives in New Zealand, but the security community as a whole, particularly in Australia, is not going to turn on a deal such as the AUKUS deal. It simply will not happen. Now, the thing that I find interesting, and this gets into the subs themselves, is Selwyn mentioned the refrigerator-sized reactor. And I think we need to think about this in terms of climate change and what have you. I'm agnostic. I'll start by saying I'm agnostic. I'm not a nuclear physicist, so God knows what I know. But the deal is this: the reactors on nuclear submarines are really quite small. And the enriched uranium that is used in these fast attack submarines, the reason it's weapons grade is that they're highly efficient. And so you need less fuel for the longer patrols. And there's nothing close to a detonator or a trigger on these reactors. And the casing in which the reactor is located pretty much mitigates against, well, certainly a nuclear explosion on board, but even meltdowns that are catastrophic. Okay? This is why propulsion is different than being armed. Then you've got a live warhead. That's a whole different kettle of fish. So I think that we need to understand that the miniaturization of nuclear power may eventually be advantageous from a climate change perspective. Again, I have no serious skill set that allows me to weigh in one way or the other, but I think that it may be a consideration that not only greenies, but policymakers across the political spectrum need to think about going forward if we're truly going to confront the problem of fossil fuels and producing catastrophic climate change. Now, in terms of the equation that we're discussing today, I think, again, it goes back to the carrot and the stick. This whole discussion about AUKUS is about the stick that is being waved at the Chinese. The West needs to find carrots that are convincing to the Chinese to modify their behavior. I'm not entirely sure that their behavior can be modified under President Xi, but the point is that right now this is being portrayed as all stick and no carrot. And what I would simply say is there better be serious diplomatic overtures being made in the capitals in Europe, the United States, Australia, even here as a well-intentioned interlocutor towards the Chinese to tell them, if in fact your behavior changes in ways that are more cooperative, more that adhere more to the rules-based order, then perhaps this containment policy will be loosened somewhat. And that's the key. The Chinese can come back and go, yes, but the rules-based order is made in a Western image. And I would say, bring it on. What image do you think is preferred? Because you have to deal with that order. What modifications will allow you to prosper and won't threaten the economic and physical security of the West? That, I think, is a starting point for negotiations. But unfortunately, you have to wave the stick for the Chinese to come to the table.
On the nuclear issue, and I suppose I gave you the last word, Paul, but you know me, I snuck in there with a car salesman's ethic, and I'm just going to have a quick pitch here myself. And it's something that Liz is putting in here, and I guess being a born and bred New Zealander, I can kind of see the merits in it. She says the last thing the Pacific nations need is more nuclear anything. Haven't they suffered enough? From the point of view of testing in the Pacific and what we've seen go wrong with even nuclear generation. I've got to say New Zealand's anti-nuclear laws do not cover the generation for power and energy on the country. That's a point that a lot of people don't realise. But within the Pacific, who can argue against that? I'm not dropping here, but I did a number of years ago a documentary called The Morality of Argument, Sustaining a State of Being Nuclear Free. It's about an hour and a bit long, that one, and it goes right into how the Pacific has suffered over the years and has made its case to adapt. Those are where the sensitivities come from. That's where the support for the law relating to anti-nuclear has been able to endure on in a country like New Zealand, but specifically in other countries in the Pacific too that would aspire to such things. On that, you can see that Paul and I have great debates. Well, thank you for your company to the audience. Thank you, Paul, for your company and contribution once again today. And we look forward to coming back to you again, scheduled for next Thursday, New Zealand time, around midday. And that is with daylight saving changes around 7 p.m, as I understand it, on the eastern United States side. And that would be on a Wednesday evening. Until that time, thank you again, take care, and goodbye.